Jim, for this late night drive-through question, we're going to talk about Barry Windham. We've received several questions from many listeners about him, so let's try to tackle some of these right here, right now. The first one is from Andrew Dawson out of Charleston, West Virginia. One of my favorite wrestlers growing up was Barry Windham. I have always wondered why promoters like Crockett would not make this guy world champion. I thought he had all the tools, and for a man that was 6'6" to 6'7", he moved around the ring pretty darn good. What are your thoughts as to why Barry Windham never got past mid-card titles?
Oh, God. Well, he was a ballet dancer at that size. He was just amazing, fluid and coordinated. And he was going to be at several different times. He was going to be a world champion. I've heard, like Flair one time said, I've heard other people said that they weren't sure that he wanted it. I don't know that Barry wanted the pressure at that point when you were the world champion. It was a shoot position in that you were supposed to be the guy drawing the money. Everything revolved around you. The success or failure of a number of promotions sometimes depended on, whether you were a box office attraction or not. And I don't know whether he wanted the pressure. Don't know whether he wanted it. And then, he ended up by the time the 90s rolled around, he had knee problems and his weight started getting out of control because everybody in the family gets big sooner or later. Even though he was small starting out, he was skinny starting out. And then he filled in and he was perfect at probably about 250, 260, whatever. But then he got bigger. He switched promotions a lot because he got ticked off, as we all did, sometimes at the way he was treated or the way he was used or whatever. But he was back and forth so much. NWA, WWF, territory to territory, injuries, right place, right time, sometimes not being there, just a variety of things. He was at one point, possibly the best in-ring performer in the business, but at the same time, while he was always featured as a star, he was never the star.
Our next part of this question comes from Randy. In 1984, Barry Windham was going to Mid-Atlantic because Dusty asked him to, but instead he went to the WWF. If Barry stays in Mid-Atlantic, does Dusty still bring in Magnum TA? And if Barry stays in the WWF, do you think he would have eventually wound up in the spot Bret had in 92, or does he take the Warrior spot in 1990, replacing Hogan?
He wouldn't have taken either one of those spots. And no, Dusty wouldn't have brought Magnum in, not then at least. If Barry Windham had stayed in Charlotte, Barry Windham would have got the Magnum TA spot, and he would have been the champion, and et cetera, et cetera. But he didn't. He switched, and he went to the WWF, and I can't even remember what the reason was. I know he had one at the time, but I don't think Dusty ever particularly got over that, because when Dusty went to the Carolinas, that was his big chance. He had booked Florida. He was already a top box office attraction as a wrestler, but that was going to be the biggest territory he had ever booked to that point in time in his life, or ever would book. And he wanted Barry Windham, who was like his protege, Batman and Robin. They were not indispensable. What's the word I'm searching for? Indivisible. So he wouldn't have brought Magnum in because he wouldn't have needed to. But since Barry left, he did bring Magnum in, which now you can make the case that Barry Windham leaving the Carolinas for the WWF is the reason why Magnum had the wreck. So you never know about these things.
It's crazy to think about that. It's crazy to think about the alternate universe where Barry's the one getting the same push that Magnum got. Barry's the one working with Nikita. I mean, it's an interesting little what if.
But at any rate, so that would have happened, and he would have been the NWA champion because Barry probably wouldn't have had the wreck, but it would have happened before Crockett had to sell in 88. So he would have got that run in, but, and once again, he would have never who did he say he was going to replace the WWF? Bret or Warrior?
Bret's push in 92 and the Warrior. I think with the Warrior is less about replacing the Warrior than being the next in line after Hogan.
Well, no. Vince McMahon would have never, ever put Barry Windham in either one of those positions. Barry was never going to have the bodybuilder physique, because he was just one of those guys where he was in better shape and could work rings around everybody else on the roster. He wasn't going to have big muscles. And also, I don't believe he would have ever been able to cut a promo that would have blinded Vince to the fact that he didn't have big muscles.
Barry, of course, walks out in 85 from his tag team with Mike Rotunda. They had been really over and had a huge push, but he walks out, and eventually he ends up back with Dusty. Not right away, Because I think Dusty, like you said, didn't get over the fact that Barry walked out on him previously. But eventually he goes back there. He goes back to the WWF in 1989.
Well, wait a minute. Barry didn't come in until after Magnum's accident, did he?
Yeah, I guess I didn't even realize that. Yeah, Barry didn't show up, and then they put him with Ron Garvin right away after Magnum's accident. So, interesting. Because they went back to Florida, which at that time was pretty much purgatory. Yeah. As a wrestling promotion. He goes back to the WWF in 1989 as the Widowmaker. And again, he walks out. This time it's because of the legal issues around his brother and father, which were going on at that time. And of course, he ends up back in the NWA when you were the booker still, or one of the bookers on the
Wait a minute.
team.
Don't put that whole thing on me.
You were on the booking team when Barry returned. But then he goes back to the WWF several years later, and you're there again. And I think that's what this question is about. This is from Blake McChristie. I've always wondered about Barry Windham in the WWF. He seemed extremely underused. As a former NWA champion, was this a slight? Did McMahon like him or not, or was it just bad timing?
No, he was involved about the time that Russo was trying to do that fucking NWA invasion thing to make us all look bad, look like idiots. So that was an intentional run where all of us involved looked like fucking morons. And Barry Windham was synonymous with the NWA in a lot of people's minds. So, and then he was one of the new Blackjacks. So,
but also he was brought in with a gimmick that you now have. He was the Stalker. Whose idea was that?
Once again, whether it was somebody in Vince's inner circle or creative services or whatever, because they interviewed Barry and found out he liked to go hunting. As a matter of fact, he lives or at the time he was living in South Georgia, I think, or somewhere out there where that's all he did all day was go out hunting. And so, okay, well, there you go. And there's another, whether you're a plumber or you played hockey when you were a kid or you fucking go hunting or whatever, they're going to take it and run with it. And that's what happened. And that was fucking rotten too.
It certainly was. The final part of this question.
But one thing you just revealed, Barry left here and went there, left there and went here. That's one of the reasons why that his career did not, he was so good. If he'd have stayed someplace that he was appreciated, treated well, and used right. And, especially with Dusty in his corner, it'd have been a different story, but he never stayed.
Had you already left for your brief sabbatical in 89 when Barry left the NWA?
God, I can't even remember. We were off probably from the middle of April to the middle of June.
Because it's pretty interesting thinking what 89 NWA would have been like if Barry Windham had been in the mix, but he took himself out of it.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing. We had that great match Flair and Barry against the Midnight. The only time we ever worked with Flair as a team on television. And Barry he was in a great spot there, and that was what Christmas time of 88, Seasons Beatings. And then boom, within the next 3 or 4 months, he'd gone again.
And that's a great match too. 3 of the best workers in the world at that time, Bobby Eaton, Ric Flair, and Barry Windham in the same match. But the final part of this question from Jonathan Meisner, Jim. He was discussing some classic wrestling with some friends, and the Barry Windham Ric Flair 45-minute draw that took up an entire episode of Worldwide came up. In your opinion, is this the greatest free match ever on television? Can you think of one better?
Oh my God. Well, a free match on television, it would have been Flair and Steamboat at the Clash and Superdome in 89. There was the Midnight Express and the Fantastics going the whole hour on Worldwide for the U.S. tag title in 88. It was a tremendous match. Let's just say that. It was part of the Forgotten Trilogy, because a lot of people remember the 3 Flair Steamboat matches on big shows that were so great. But when you think about it, in completely different matches, and maybe even, I dare I say, just a touch better in some instances, was Flair and Windham Battle of the Belts in Florida, Flair and Windham Crockett Cup 87, Flair and Windham, that Worldwide episode you just talked about. So from 86 to 87, they had 3 matches on major broadcasts that were pretty fucking darn good.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is the Forgotten Trilogy, just like I feel the Forgotten Feud, the forgotten great matches that no one talks about, I always do, is the Midnight Express versus Windham and Garvin.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun because Barry was so good and Ronnie was such a veteran and a pro and experienced and everything. And he had the people and he knew what to do. That it was completely different style of matches and fun. We worked with those guys for quite a while, on and off, especially for the U.S. tag team titles. But it was fun on especially spot shows. And by spot shows, I mean, you know, the little towns, whether it be the small towns in North and South Carolina that only had 1,500 or 2,000 people there or whatever, or, you know, smaller shows like that. But sometimes just to keep themselves amused, Bobby and Barry would do shit like they'd have a match on their knees where they would actually, you know, somehow or another, and the people wouldn't be able to tell anything was going on, but somehow they'd end up on their knees and they would lock up with each other while they were on their knees. And then Windham would slam Bobby while he was on his knees. Boom. Or arm drag him while he was on his knees. Then Bobby would hit the ropes for a spot, but he'd hit the second rope instead of the top rope. He'd stagger and he'd fall and hit the second rope and come back, and fucking Barry would goddamn arm drag him while he was on his knees. And they would be having this fucking match and people would be popping and cheering and nobody would know that anything was wrong or anything was amiss. But meanwhile, they were so far ahead of everybody else. They were making it harder and giving themselves a handicap just to keep it interesting.